The autumn wind rustled through the maple trees outside the tiny apartment window as May sat curled up in her favorite reading spot. She hadn't said a word for 3 months now, not since that rainy evening when everything changed. The doctors called it trauma-induced silence, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. Words just felt too heavy, too meaningless to express what she was feeling inside. Her grandmother, who everyone in the neighborhood called Nani, kept busy in their small kitchen, the gentle clink of dishes filling the quiet apartment. The smell of ginger tea drifted through the air, a familiar comfort in this unfamiliar life they now shared. Living above the music store wasn't their choice, but it was all they could afford after the accident. Every afternoon, sounds from the store below floated up through the old wooden floorboards. Sometimes it was the cheerful melody of a child's first piano lesson. Other times, the determined practice of teenagers preparing for recitals. Maya would close her eyes and let the music wash over her, each note stirring memories she tried so hard to keep locked away. Her school counselor visited twice a week, bringing worksheets and encouraging smiles. They'd sit together at the kitchen table while Nani pretended to be busy with laundry, though Mai knew she was watching, hoping for any sign that her granddaughter might speak again. The counselor would talk about progress and small steps, but May just drew patterns in her notebook, swirling lines that looked like music notes dancing across the page. At night, when the store closed and silence settled over the building, Mai would sometimes press her ear to the floor, trying to catch even the faintest echo of music. In those quiet moments, she remembered how her mother used to play the piano every evening after dinner. The memory of those gentle melodies felt like a warm embrace she couldn't quite hold on to. Her classmates had stopped trying to make her talk. Instead, they'd learned to communicate through notes passed in class and quick text messages. Her best friend, Rin, would sit with her during lunch, filling the silence with stories about everything and nothing, never expecting me to respond, but making sure she knew she wasn't alone. Some days, Mai would stand by the window, watching people enter and exit the music store below. Young kids clutching sheet music, elderly couples holding hands as they browsed through vinyl records, teenagers with guitar cases slung over their shoulders. Each person carried their own relationship with music, while hers sat frozen inside her chest like a song waiting to be played. The apartment walls had become both a sanctuary and a prison. Photos of happier times stayed tucked away in boxes. Mai couldn't bear to hang them up yet. But her mother's old music box sat on her bedside table, though she hadn't opened it since moving in. Its presence was enough, a silent reminder of the melody that once filled her life. As the days grew shorter and colder, Mai noticed how the music from downstairs seemed to change too. The autumn recital season brought more serious pieces, filled with minor chords that matched the gray skies outside. Sometimes, when a particular piece would drift up through the floorboards, she'd catch Nani wiping tears from her eyes, knowing the music spoke the words they both couldn't say. In the evenings, Nani would cook dinner while humming old folk songs from her childhood. She never pressed May to speak, never showed frustration at the silence. Instead, she filled their home with gentle sounds, the soft shuffling of her slippers across the floor, the quiet turning of newspaper pages, the low hum of the radio playing classical music. It was her way of telling Mai that sometimes words weren't necessary to show love. The music store's wooden stairs creaked under May's feet as she made her way down for the first time in 3 months. It was Tuesday afternoon, and she knew Nani wouldn't be home from her shift at the restaurant for another 3 hours. The store owner, Uncle Lai, as everyone called him, was busy with a violin lesson in the front room. His gentle voice drifted through the building, mixing with the sound of a beginner's hesitant bow strokes. The back room had always intrigued her. Through the thin walls of their apartment, she could sometimes hear muffled music coming from there, different from the practice room's usual sounds. Her feet seemed to move on their own, drawn by some invisible force toward that mystery. The door wasn't locked. Inside, dust particles danced in the streams of sunlight that broke through the half-closed blinds. Sheet music sat in neat piles on wooden shelves, their pages slightly yellowed with age. But what caught her eye was the grand piano in the corner. Not just any piano, but a beautiful old Yamaha with ivory keys that had turned a soft cream color over the years. Mi's heart started beating faster as she approached it. The piano looked like it had stories to tell, its polished wood surface reflecting the warm afternoon light. A memory flashed through her mind. Sitting next to her mother on their old piano bench, her small fingers learning to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, while her mother's hands guided hers across the keys. Her fingers trembled as they hovered over the piano. She hadn't touched a keyboard since that rainy night 3 months ago. The dust on the keys left little marks where her fingertips almost, but didn't quite, make contact. It was like touching a photograph of someone you missed. You could see them, but couldn't quite reach them. The violin lesson in the front room ended, and she heard footsteps and voices saying goodbye. Her heart jumped. She shouldn't be here. But before she could move, the back room door opened slowly. Uncle Lai stood there, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners as he saw her by the piano. He didn't say anything at first, just walked over to the window and opened the blinds a little more, letting in more light. Then he pulled out the piano bench and gestured to it with a slight nod. No pressure, just an invitation. Mai stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't voice. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Uncle Lai simply walked to a shelf and began organizing sheet music, his movements quiet and unhurried. It reminded her of how Nanny would bustle around the apartment, giving Mai space while letting her know she wasn't alone. Finally, Mai sat down. The bench felt familiar somehow, even though she'd never sat on it before. Her fingers found their place on the keys naturally, muscle memory from years of practice taking over. The first note surprised her. She hadn't meant to play it. But there it was, hanging in the air between her and Uncle Lai, who had stopped organizing but didn't turn around. More notes followed, hesitant at first, like a baby bird testing its wings. It was a simple piece, one of the first her mother had taught her. Her fingers remembered even if her mind wanted to forget. The melody was quiet, almost a whisper, but in the dusty back room of a music store on a Tuesday afternoon, it felt like the beginning of something new. Uncle Lai still hadn't turned around when she finished playing. Instead, he walked to his desk, wrote something on a small piece of paper, and placed it on top of the piano. Then he left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Mai stood up and looked at the note. In neat handwriting, it read, "The piano needs someone to play it. Come whenever you want." As she climbed the stairs back to the apartment, her fingers still tingled with the memory of the keys. For the first time in 3 months, the silence inside her didn't feel quite so heavy. She couldn't explain it, but something had shifted, like the first ray of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The evening sun painted long shadows across the music store's floor as Uncle Lai was getting ready to close up. He paused at the sound of music floating from the back room. Someone was playing Moonlight Sonata. The notes were hesitant at first, like footsteps on fresh snow, but grew more confident with each measure. He knew it was Mai. She'd been coming down every day for the past week, always waiting until the last student left. At first, she would play for just a few minutes, simple pieces that reminded him of morning dew, delicate and fresh. But today was different. Today, the music had weight to it, carrying emotions that words couldn't express. Through the door's frosted glass, he could see her silhouette at the piano. Her posture reminded him of his own daughter, now grown and teaching music in another city. He remembered how music had helped her through difficult times too. Some feelings, he knew, could only be spoken through keys and melodies. As the piece progressed, Uncle Lai noticed a small crowd gathering outside the store's window. An elderly couple who often walked their dog at this hour had stopped to listen. A teenager with headphones around his neck stood perfectly still, phone forgotten in his hand. Even the busy noodle shop owner across the street had stepped outside, drawn by the music that spilled onto the sidewalk. Inside, Mai was lost in her own world. Her fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence, each note carrying a piece of her story. The song spoke of moonlit nights and quiet tears, of memories both sweet and painful. It was her mother's favorite piece, one they used to play together on quiet evenings at home. Uncle Lai watched as more people gathered outside. Nobody spoke, they just listened, understanding that they were witnessing something special. A delivery boy on his bicycle stopped, then slowly got off to join the crowd. Two students from the local high school paused their animated conversation, their eyes drawn to the source of the music. The final notes of the piece hung in the air like stars appearing at twilight. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, from outside, came the sound of soft applause. Mi jumped slightly. She hadn't realized she had an audience. Uncle Lai watched as she quickly gathered her things, her cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and something else. Maybe pride. Before she could rush upstairs, Uncle Lai stepped into the back room. He didn't speak. They had developed their own silent language over the past week. Instead, he placed a small key on top of the piano. It was old and slightly tarnished, attached to a faded red ribbon. Mai looked at it questioningly. He picked up a notepad from his desk and wrote, "For when you need to play, even after hours. Music shouldn't have a schedule." Then he added, "Just remember to lock up." Mai stared at the key for a long moment. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up, running her finger along its ridges. She looked up at Uncle Lai, and though she didn't speak, her eyes said everything. Gratitude, fear, hope, all mixed together like colors in a sunset. That night, long after the store had closed and the streets had grown quiet, soft piano music drifted through the neighborhood again. Those who heard it felt something stir in their hearts, a reminder that even in silence, the soul finds ways to speak. Upstairs, Nanny sat in her favorite chair, listening to her granddaughter play. She didn't wipe away her tears this time, letting them fall freely as the music wrapped around her like a warm embrace. Through the floor, she could feel the vibrations of each note, each one a small step on her granddaughter's journey back to herself. In the days that followed, people began to recognize the time just after sunset as piano time. They would slow their walks home, lingering near the music store to catch a few moments of whatever piece Mai was playing. Some brought chairs from nearby shops, creating an informal evening concert on the sidewalk. Nobody knew the story of the silent girl who played with such feeling, but somehow they all understood that they were part of something healing, something beautiful. Word spread through the neighborhood like ripples in a pond. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, people would find reasons to walk past the music store. The flower shop owner started closing a bit later, arranging her displays while listening to the melodies that floated through the evening air. The coffee shop across the street added outdoor seating, where customers lingered over cooling cups just to hear a few more notes. Nobody knew exactly who was playing. Some thought it was a professional musician practicing after hours. Others believed it was a music student preparing for a big competition. The mystery only added to the magic of these twilight concerts. Mi's playing had grown stronger, more confident. She chose pieces that matched her moods, some days light and hopeful like morning sunshine, other days deep and thoughtful like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Through the piano, she could finally tell her story, even if nobody knew it was hers. One rainy evening, she played Chopin's Raindrop Prelude. The steady rhythm of the rain outside mixed with the gentle notes, creating a symphony that brought tears to the eyes of those listening under their umbrellas. An old man who always sat on the bench outside closed his eyes and remembered rainy days from his childhood. A young mother held her baby closer, swaying gently to the music. The regular listeners had developed their own little community. They would nod to each other in recognition, sharing small smiles when familiar pieces began to play. Sometimes they brought thermoses of hot tea to share, or homemade cookies wrapped in paper napkins. They never spoke much during the music. They didn't need to. Up in their apartment, Nani noticed small changes in her granddaughter. Mi's shoulders seemed lighter, her steps less heavy. Though she still didn't speak, her eyes had regained some of their old sparkle. Sometimes, Nani would catch her tapping her fingers on the kitchen table during breakfast, playing invisible keys to songs only she could hear. At school, Mi's friend Rin noticed changes too. During lunch, instead of staring at her food, Mai would draw musical notes in her notebook. Sometimes she would share her earbuds with Rin, playing recordings of pieces she was learning. It was her way of speaking, of sharing what was in her heart. One evening, a young girl in a pink coat broke away from her mother's hand and pressed her face against the store window, trying to peek inside. "I'd want to learn to play like that," she declared loudly. Her mother gently pulled her back, embarrassed, but several people in the crowd nodded in agreement. The mysterious pianist had awakened something in all of them. A reminder of the beauty that could exist in a world that often felt too busy, too noisy. Uncle Lai watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. He had started leaving sheet music on the piano, pieces he thought Mai might like. Sometimes they would disappear for a few days, only to return with small pencil marks noting fingering suggestions or expression marks. It was their way of having conversations about music, without ever saying a word. The local newspaper's culture reporter caught wind of the evening concerts and came to write a story. She interviewed the regular listeners, collecting their stories about what the music meant to them. An elderly couple spoke about how it reminded them of their first date at a concert hall. A tired office worker described how the music helped wash away the stress of the day. A street artist mentioned how he had started timing his chalk drawings to coincide with the evening performances, finding inspiration in the melodies. That evening, Mi played with extra feeling, as if thanking her unknown audience for listening, for understanding. She chose a piece that started softly, like a whispered secret, then grew into something powerful and brave. As she played the final notes, the sound of gentle applause drifted up from the street below, just as it did every night. But tonight, mixed with the clapping, she heard something else. Voices humming along with the melody, carrying her music back to her like a gift. The notice came on a Tuesday morning, stark black letters on white paper taped to the music store's front door. Uncle Lai stood there for a long moment, his shoulders heavy as he read the words again. Notice of rent increase. The numbers at the bottom of the page made his heart sink. Triple the current rent, starting next month. Inside the store, he sat at his desk, surrounded by 30 years of memories. Pictures of students at their first recitals, thank you cards from parents, old competition programs. All yellow with age, but rich with stories. His fingers traced the edge of a particularly old photograph showing the store on its opening day, back when the street was lined with family businesses instead of shiny new coffee chains. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. The flower shop owner dropped by with worry in her eyes, clutching the cup of tea that grew cold as they talked about rising rents and changing times. The elderly couple who always listened to the evening concerts stood outside longer than usual, as if trying to memorize every detail of the storefront. That evening, for the first time in weeks, no music came from the back room. Mai had arrived at her usual time, only to find Uncle Lai sitting at the piano, staring at the keys without playing. When she saw the notice in his hands, something inside her froze. The piano had become her voice, her way of speaking to the world. The thought of losing it felt like losing her parents all over again. Upstairs, Nani noticed the silence immediately. She watched her granddaughter push away her dinner plate, barely touched, and retreat to her room. Through the thin walls, she could hear the soft sound of fingers tapping on the windowsill, playing phantom melodies that had nowhere to go. The next day, a small crowd gathered outside the store. The regular evening listeners stood in groups, talking in low voices about what could be done. The coffee shop owner across the street offered to start a fundraiser. A local music teacher suggested organizing a benefit concert, but the numbers were too big, the timeline too short. Mai sat at the piano that evening, but her hands felt heavy. She started to play her mother's favorite piece, but the notes came out wrong, discordant. For the first time since she'd started playing again, the music wouldn't come. The silence felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Uncle Lee found her there, tears falling silently onto the ivory keys. He sat beside her on the bench, just as he had that first day. From his pocket, he pulled out an old photograph. A young girl at this same piano, her small hands stretched wide to reach the chords. "My daughter," he wrote on a notepad, "she learned to play on this piano. Now she teaches music in another city. Some things don't end, they just change form." But Maya couldn't see how this change could be anything but an ending. The piano had become more than just an instrument. It was her sanctuary, her connection to both her past and her future. Through its keys, she had found a way to keep her parents' memory alive, to speak without words, to be heard without making a sound. That night, the regular listeners waited outside, but no music came. A young artist who usually drew with chalk on the sidewalk during the concerts instead wrote a message. "Music lives here." Others began adding their own messages around it, stories of what the evening concerts had meant to them, how the mysterious pianist had touched their lives. Up in their apartment, May lay awake, listening to the unusual quiet. Her fingers moved restlessly, playing invisible keys in the darkness. The silence felt wrong now, like a song cut off mid-phrase. She thought about all the people who had stood outside in rain and shine, listening to her play. They had become part of her story without knowing it, just as she had become part of theirs. The next morning, she found a pile of letters pushed under the store's door. Notes from neighbors, from students, from strangers who had stopped to listen on their way home from work. They wrote about how the music had helped them through difficult days, how it had reminded them of joy in simple things, how it had brought light to their evenings. Each letter was a testament to the power of music to build bridges between hearts, to heal wounds, to create community. The idea started with a single post on the local community board. The high school music teacher had written about the evening concerts and the music store's situation. By morning, the post had spread across neighborhood groups, shared hundreds of times. People who had never visited the store began sharing their own stories of walking past and being moved by the mysterious evening pianist. In the apartment above the store, Mai sat at her desk, surrounded by sheet music. For the first time since she started playing again, she wasn't just practicing pieces, she was writing her own. The melody had come to her in fragments, like pieces of a dream. The sound of her mother's laugh, the quiet moments with her father, the warmth of Nanny's cooking, the kindness in Uncle Lay's eyes. The neighborhood buzzed with activity. The coffee shop owner printed flyers announcing a benefit concert at the high school auditorium. The local bakery promised to provide refreshments. Art students designed posters featuring a piano wrapped in golden light. Even the stern-faced businessman, who rarely stopped to listen, offered his company's sound equipment for free. But Mai hadn't played for 3 days. The piano downstairs stood silent, its keys gathering dust. Every time, she thought about performing in front of a real audience. Not just invisible listeners on the street. Her hands would shake so badly, she could barely hold a pencil. The thought of people watching her, knowing her story, seeing her pain. It felt like too much. Nanny found her granddaughter one evening, curled up in front of the living room window. Without words, she sat down beside her and pulled out an old photo album. Inside were pictures of May's mother at her first piano recital, her face a mix of terror and excitement. Another showed her performing at her high school graduation, confident and strong. She was scared too, Nanny wrote on a notepad, but she played anyway. That's what brave means. Uncle Lai left the door to the back room unlocked, just in case. One night, long after everyone had gone home, Mai crept downstairs. The street was empty except for a stray cat watching from a windowsill. She sat at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys. Then, slowly, she began to play. not someone else's music, but her own. The piece started softly, like raindrops on a window. It spoke of loss and silence, of days spent watching the world from behind glass. Then the melody changed, growing stronger, weaving in fragments of her mother's favorite songs. She played about finding the piano in the back room, about the people who listened on the street, about a community that had become family without saying a word. As she played, she didn't notice the tears falling onto the keys or the way her shoulders had finally relaxed. The music flowed from somewhere deep inside, telling the story she hadn't been able to speak. When the last note faded away, she realized she'd found her answer. The next morning, she handed Uncle Lai a folded piece of paper. Inside was a simple message: "I'll play at the concert." His smile lit up the whole room as he hugged her gently. Then he pointed to the piano and raised an eyebrow. Time to practice. Word spread quickly about the mysterious evening pianist finally performing in public. The high school auditorium, which had seemed too ambitious at first, began to feel too small. People called asking about tickets, offering to help set up chairs, wanting to be part of this moment. Mai spent every spare moment at the piano, polishing her composition. Sometimes her fingers stumbled, sometimes the notes came out wrong, but she kept playing. Each mistake was a step forward, each correction a small victory. The piece was growing with her, becoming not just a song about loss, but about finding your way back home. The day before the concert, she found a package outside their apartment door. Inside was a simple black dress with a note from the neighbors: "For our pianist." It was the first time anyone had called her that, and something shifted inside her. She wasn't just the silent girl anymore. She was a musician, ready to share her story with the world. The high school auditorium buzzed with excitement on concert night. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls, programs clutched in their hands. The regular evening listeners sat in the front rows, their faces glowing with pride as if they were family. In many ways, they were. Backstage, Mai stood in her new black dress, running her fingers over the smooth fabric. Through the curtain, she could hear the murmur of the crowd, the rustle of programs, the quiet anticipation. Her heart beat so fast she thought it might burst from her chest. Nanny adjusted the small white flower in her granddaughter's hair, just as she used to do for May's mother before performances. In her eyes, Mai could see both sadness and joy, the weight of memories and the promise of new beginnings. Uncle Lee appeared with a cup of warm tea, placing it in her trembling hands with a gentle pat on her shoulder. The high school music teacher stepped onto the stage to introduce the evening. She spoke about community, about the power of music to heal and connect people. As she talked about the mysterious pianist who had brought magic to their evening streets, May closed her eyes and thought about her journey, from silence to sound, from loss to love. Then it was time. Walking onto the stage felt like walking through a dream. The grand piano waited in the spotlight, its polished surface reflecting the stage lights like stars. As Mai sat down, she caught a glimpse of familiar faces in the audience. The flower shop owner, who always smiled as she passed, the elderly couple who never missed an evening concert, her friend from school who had sat with her through so many silent lunches. Her fingers found the keys, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The piece began softly, just as she had practiced it, like the first light of dawn breaking through darkness. The melody spoke of rainy days and teardrops, of empty rooms and heavy silences. But then it changed, growing stronger, weaving in echoes of her mother's favorite songs, hints of the music that had filled their home. As she played, memories floated through her mind like autumn leaves. Her father's laugh, her mother's hands guiding hers on the keys, Nanny's quiet strength, Uncle Lai's kindness, the warmth of strangers becoming friends. The music swelled, becoming not just a song about loss, but about finding your way back to light, about the family you're born with and the family you find. The final section of her piece surprised even her. It wasn't just about her story anymore. It had become about everyone who had stood outside in rain and shine to listen. about a community that had come together to save more than just a music store. The notes danced and soared, full of hope and possibility, like birds taking flight. As the last note faded into silence, Mai opened her eyes. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, like a wave, the audience rose to their feet. The applause wasn't just polite. It was full of love and understanding, of shared experiences and collective joy. Through tear-blurred vision, she saw Uncle Lai wiping his eyes, Nanny beaming with pride, and hundreds of faces she knew and didn't know, all connected by this moment. Standing up, Mai faced the audience. Her throat felt tight, but for the first time in months, words didn't feel impossible. Stepping to the microphone, she whispered 2 words that carried to every corner of the hall. Thank you. The crowd grew even louder, but she wasn't finished. Taking a deep breath, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Music has been my voice when I couldn't find words. You all listened when I needed to be heard. This isn't just my story. It's ours. Later that night, after the hugs and congratulations, after the announcement that the store had received enough donations to stay open, after the last guest had gone home, Mai sat at the old piano in the back room. The keys that had once seemed dusty and forgotten now gleamed with possibility. She played a few notes, not a song, just a gentle melody that floated up through the floorboards to where Nani sat smiling in their apartment above. The next evening, just as the sun began to set, music once again drifted through the neighborhood streets. But this time, when people stopped to listen, they didn't just hear beautiful melodies, they heard the sound of healing, of community, of home. They heard the story of a girl who found her voice through music, and of a neighborhood that learned to listen with their hearts.